Kind of calm down just a little bit.
We're talking
during
state
the
stuff.
break.
We love each other.
We do. We really do.
We really do love each other. Yeah,
right. You know?
We just disagree.
Well, let's move on from the government shutdown now to South Carolina politics. Earlier this week, Governor McMaster outlining his budget, including a 5% pay raise for teachers. And how about this, a $200 million rebate for South Carolinians?
The devil's always in the details. That old familiar saying I learned growing up in Swansea is I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day of the week. So we'll see how this all plays out from a legislative standpoint. Keep in mind the governor in this state has very limited ability to really do what they write or what they say. And so we'll see how this plays out. What we didn't hear from the governor potentially is how we deal with healthcare challenges, and while teacher pay is part of the equation, it's not all of it. I agree we have to do it, and I also hope that, well, I didn't hear it, but I hope to hear it from the state of how we deal with state employees and funding these agencies that have been cut under Republican leadership.
There is a huge step forward that you are going to see from both the executive and the legislative branches on true funding and reforms in education. If we were to sit here and talk about what does the education formula in South Carolina look like for how do we come up with how much dollars get spent, it would take us an entire show just to start beginning to go through the numbers. There have got to be plans that are put in place, and you're seeing this both in the House and the Senate, in the education committees and within the budget process, where they're trying to streamline that down and make it so that we can have real education reform. 5% increase of pay for teachers is a great step forward. It has been something that the governor has been pushing for, because education is the flip side of economic development, because when you want to have strong economic development, you have to have a well-educated workforce, which increases economic development opportunities.
Again, the teacher pay component is one part of it, but keep in mind there are school districts in the state who are still suffering from what I call the what has been before. They're still dealing with things that their great-grandparents, some cases, dealt with in what has been before. So I hope that there will be a package deal from the General Assembly to deal with education as a whole. And again, like I said, state employees are a subject matter, funding agencies like the Department of Corrections and putting more troopers on the highway and DSS, and all these things have to be talked about. And while it's cute from a public relations standpoint to say we're sending that much money back to the taxpayers, but I think we also have an obligation to make sure we fund what I call the bare bones of South Carolina. That's our state government.
The State of the State address is next Wednesday, 7 o'clock. It will be his second State of the State address as governor. You guys expecting to hear more what we heard earlier this week in his budget?
Prosperity and opportunity. Because you will hear those two, because the governor is focused on two major aspects. We've been talking about them, education being one, and economic development, because they go hand in hand with creating a stronger, more vibrant economy for our state. We're on a rise right now when it comes to the economy. Economic numbers have been great. Unemployment numbers have dropped in many places, but we still have, as the governor stated in his inaugural address, we still have areas where we've got the corridor of shame, and he wants that to be a distant memory in the minds of South Carolinians. And the way that we do that is looking at how do you begin to change the way that we're funding schools, because right now 1 out of 10 kids in South Carolina lives in Greenville County. They've got a huge tax base up there. But you go to Jasper County and their tax base is next to nothing. Hampton County, the same way, all along the I-95 corridor. And that's a place where they're going to have to think about how are we going to distribute that money that's coming out.
South Carolina still suffers like America with that great line of divide between the have and the have-nots. And so how we close that gap will be very critical. What I expect to hear from the governor is more detail on his plan of the things that he flirted with in his inaugural speech. And from there, members of the General Assembly will have to take that back and say, let's flush this out. But I always caution people when we hear political agendas, because everything on the agenda doesn't equate to being a priority.
All right, less than a minute or so left. Quickly, the medical marijuana bill Tom Davis introduced earlier this week, the Compassionate Care Act, as it's called. Is there broad support for this over at the State House?
The Compassionate Care Act has had a broad level of support, especially among Libertarians and Democrats. Where you find the rub here is going to be where law enforcement's strength within some of the connections in the Republican Party are going to be a holdout, because SLED has been very, very clear. They are against any form of the legalization of marijuana. That is where Tom Davis, from that libertarian standpoint, is trying yet again, and probably will have the greatest amount of success this year because of changes in the structure of committees within the South Carolina Senate and House.
This is a prime example of what's on the agenda and what's a priority. I think you're going to see majority of this session dedicated to dealing with the various components of trying to handle the education crisis. So it would all determine whether this becomes a priority for lawmakers.
And there's a lot of inside baseball that goes along with that.
All right, Antoine Seawright, Dave Wilson, our Republican and Democratic strategist. Guys, as always, thank you so very much for your time. It ought to be a very interesting next several days. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more, including a check on your forecast. Stay tuned.